It's one of the most tension-wrought moments of any Magic game, dealing out those first 7 cards of your deck, picking them up, and looking at your opening hand. You start asking yourself questions. Is this keepable? Should I really hold on to 6 lands and 1 spell? What if the spell is a 3-drop? Should I mulligan? That last question is one that plagues so many Magic the Gathering players all over the world, and is something we're going to tackle today in our first episode of Tolarian Tutor. But remember, this video isn't just a basic lesson in what mulligans are. We're going to be going over when is it appropriate to mulligan. Just because you have the right ratio of lands to spells, does that always mean that you keep your hand? Are there other factors you look out for? What archetypes are going to have different rules in these situations? We're not quite at the advanced level, but we're not at beginning anymore. This is Tolarian Tutor. So we all presumably know what a mulligan is. At the beginning of a Magic game, you and your opponent both draw an opening hand of 7 cards. You then have the option to shuffle it back into your deck and draw another opening hand, -1 card. This is called a mulligan. If you're still not satisfied, you can shuffle in your 6 cards to draw 5, and so on. Now, if you mulligan, after you do decide to keep a hand, you get to scry, which of course means to look at the first card of your library and either leave it at the top to draw during your turn, or put it at the bottom. The first thing that you need to understand about mulligans is that you, the player, actually get to mulligan in Magic. What do I mean by that? I mean you're given the opportunity to reset your hand with a slight disadvantage. And the key word that I want to stress here is you. This is your choice to make. So, when do you make it? When we take a look at our opening hand during Friday Night Magic or just at the kitchen table, here's the thought process that many of us run through. You're probably thinking things like, I want more than 1 land. I don't want to have more than 5 lands. I'd like to have 2 to 3 lands. Assuming I'm playing a multicolored deck, then I want to be sure that I have at least 2 colors of each land in my hand if possible. And if not, I'll mulligan. But what else should you be paying attention to other than a lands to spells ratio that might signal a need to mulligan? When you build a deck, you should have an idea of what it wants to do. Part of deck building is just having a concept and trying to execute it. Therefore, you want your opening hand to work towards that goal, no matter what. What is your deck's goal? When looking at your opening hand, make sure you have things to do with your mana that help your deck reach its goal. Magic currently favors a proactive approach where most cards on the battlefield work towards ending the game, either through combat, direct damage to your opponent, or spells like Approach of the Second Sun. So the first thing you want to do when you look at your hand is to map out exactly what you can do using these cards, assuming you can play a land and curve out on each of your turns. Ask yourself this question. If your opponent isn't able to do anything for the first few turns, what is your plan given the cards in your hand? Determining which cards to play, when to play them, is what we call sequencing, and it's an important part of deciding whether or not to mulligan your hand away. For example, let's take a look at a hand that has 4 lands and 3 3-drop creatures. This might be a good hand to mulligan since your creatures will have diminishing returns over the course of the game. As a result of those diminishing returns, you'll fall behind as your opponent casts increasingly powerful creatures, while you plateau with only 3-drops. So, if your first 7 cards aren't an actively good hand, even if you have the right ratio of lands to spells, you'll actually want to mulligan down to 6. Why? Because having 6 good cards on your opening will, on average, beat out a mediocre 7. Don't be afraid to mulligan if the hand you're keeping is not advancing the strategy you want. What do we mean by curving out? In Magic, we're restricted to playing cards based on the amount of mana we have on the battlefield. Curving is the art of being able to play a land per turn, and then playing at least 1 card that uses up all that land. You're not wasting mana, you're just being productive. Be sure that whatever you do, it's going to serve the goal of your deck. How do the rules for mulligans change between keeping a hand of 7 versus a smaller hand? So you've determined you want a mulligan, you do so, and now you have 6 new cards in front of you. What new details do you look for now? What rules have changed with a hand of 6 versus a hand of 7? First question, did your opponent mulligan as well? This is important because if your opponent did mulligan, it puts you both on a more even footing, and it is a similar situation to when you were both at 7. If you have 3 1-drop creatures and 4 lands in your hand, the first 2 turns are going to put all your creatures out. And now you have dead weight. If your deck has a very low to the ground, a very aggressive strategy, you need to make sure that the cards in your hand actually help that strategy. Do you ever mulligan below 5 cards? Mulliganing down below 5 cards is something you're rarely, if ever, going to do. Most times, even if all 5 cards are lands, at that point, it is better to keep those 5 lands and play rather than go to 4. Perhaps not in a low-to-the-ground aggressive strategy, but for almost any other strategy, such as mid-range, control, or ramp, it will have to do. This way, if you are able to draw a spell, then you are able to play it. But the reverse is not true for a no-land 5. If you keep 5 lands, you can actually play Magic. But if you keep 5 spells and no lands, no way. You can't play. Go to 4 instead. What about risk-taking? Are there ever risky hands that are worth keeping? For example, a 1-land and 4 non-land hand. Keeping a risky hand depends heavily upon the strategy of your deck. You have to keep in mind what the ratio of lands to spells is in your deck and be more aware of what you might draw. It's not ideal, but you can sometimes make it work. This is where knowing your deck is really vital. So what's the absolute lowest number of cards that you can mulligan down to? Never, ever mulligan lower than 3. Never, ever. So what are some common mistakes players make when they're trying to figure out whether or not to mulligan? Many Magic the Gathering players misunderstand or never even consider how good or bad cards are in a specific matchup against their opponent. When you're playing someone else, you need to know how your deck is going to be able to fare against your opponents. You want to be able to curve out to make your deck productive, while also making sure you have answers to what your opponent is trying to do, like removal or counter spells. Alright, so you've mulliganed. How do you decide whether you keep the card that you scry on the top of your deck or put it on the bottom? The decision to keep your scry card depends upon how well it functions with your current hand. What does it do in relationship to what you are currently keeping? How are you able to sequence that card into your current strategy? For example, a removal spell is a great card to keep, as it makes sure that you are able to take care of threats and catch up so that you can keep your plan going. How does the type of deck that you're playing affect the hands that you keep? As I've said before, every card in your hand should further your plan of winning according to your deck's style and strategy. However, remember that the difference between good players and great players is the ability to change strategies quickly when the situation no longer suits the original plan. Great players tend to be more flexible and figure out what makes sense given the situation at hand. You'll need to improvise depending on the board state and what your opponent is playing. Let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of deck archetypes and see what we should be looking for in our opening hands. Let's start with aggro. Curving out is the most important part of playing an aggro deck. Your plan is to play a bunch of weaker creature cards early, then use those creatures to kill your opponent before they can implement their own plan. You need to be sure you have the ability to apply pressure early in the game. Casting creatures and spells in your early turns and being efficient in your mana use is very important. If you are in aggro, you are on the beat down from the beginning. You're fast, and you absolutely need to put the opponent down to 0 life ASAP. Control. Curving out here is also important. It acts as more of a setup for your win condition, as opposed to just pumping out creatures. You'll be alright with not having anything to do the first turn, but later on you need to have things to do on turn 2, turn 3, etc. You will need to be reactive in order to win, so be sure to hold on to removal or counter spells. You'll also need cards that pull you ahead of the game, or maybe something that will make your opponent fall behind. We call this concept tempo, but but that's another lesson. Combo. Combo decks use a combination of a few cards that work together to instantly or rapidly win the game. Though there are myriad different combo decks out there, they tend to fall into two categories. Combo decks that need a lot of pieces to work, or decks that only need a few. Depending on which style of combo you're playing, you'll need to scrutinize your opening hand in order to see how it'll help you reach your win condition. An opening hand that has a bunch of the pieces you need with some mana to help play them will definitely be worth keeping if you're playing a more intricate combo. Whereas a deck that has fewer combo pieces can have a more forgiving opening hand that doesn't need quite as many plays in its first few turns. As with so many aspects of Magic the Gathering, the art of the mulligan is something that can only be improved upon with practice. In this episode, we've covered a bunch of topics that help build your understanding of the nuances of mulligans, including what we need to pay attention to, common mistakes that are made and when to keep a risky hand, curving out and sequencing how to play your hand, what to look for when you scry your top card, mulliganing with different deck archetypes, focusing specifically on aggro, control, and combo. While drawing those first 7 cards can fill you with anticipation or dread, always keep in mind what the goal of your deck is and how the cards in your hand might be able to get you there. While drawing those first 7 cards can fill you with anticipation or dread, always keep in mind what the goal of your deck is and how the cards in your hand might be able to get you there. This is Tolarian Community College. I'm the professor. Our professional consultant is my own tutor, Emma Handy. Michelle Rapp is our script supervisor. And remember, it's not about winning individual games of Magic. It's about getting better, win or lose. This week's episode of Tolarian Tutor, as well as next week's and the week after that, has been brought to you by the same people who bring you every single video here at Tolarian Community College. And that is, of course, our patrons over at Patreon. If you feel programs like Tolarian Tutor have value to you and the community, then maybe consider going over to patreon.com and becoming a patron of this channel today. It's thanks to their support, thanks to your support, that this channel is not only going, but also growing strong. So thank you.